Hey, this is Tom, and I'm going to be talking about how exposure works with 400 ISO or ASA film, black and white film. Now, I say ISO or ASA because ASA was commonly used. Now, ISO is more commonly used. So, depending on the age of the camera you have, it may say ASA and it may say ISO. Okay, so exposure is made up of three factors: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, on film, right, if we're using this roll of HP5 ISO 400 speed film, we have 36 exposures, and that means all 36 exposures are going to be made at ISO 400. Okay, now there are other options when it comes to ISOs, right? 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. We could push this film, meaning rate it higher than 400, or we could pull this film, rate it lower than 400, or we can expose this film at what's called box speed. And box speed is 400, and that's what we're going to be doing this semester. So we're going to photograph at 400 ISO. Now, so you put the roll of film in your camera, and you've got 36 chances at ISO 400. So we're going to assume ISO 400. Now, what you would need to figure out then, depending on the light that you have, is what your shutter speed's going to be. And that's going to determine how long the light coming through the lens will be exposed to the piece of film, right? And depending on the camera you have and the lens you have, you may have a lens that could have a maximum opening of 2.8, right? That circle there is how wide it is. Or you may have a lens that the maximum opening is f4, or it could be 1.4. It's really going to depend on your camera and lens combination. For example, on this Olympus OM1, this is a 28 millimeter lens, which is a wider angle lens, which means it has a wider field of view. Its maximum aperture is 3.5. So what we need to do is we need to meter the scene that we're looking at based on ISO 400, a shutter speed, and an aperture, and we need to get all three of them working together so we get a correct exposure. And all that's going to be based on the light that you have available to you. So if you're outside, for example, you're probably going to be at 500th of a second, which is a very quick, what's that sound like? It sounds like this. Did you hear how that was really quick, right? Versus, say, a quarter of a second. What's this sound like? You hear how that sounded longer, right? If you're outside and you're getting that and it's sunny, you need to double check your shutter speed and make sure that you're at a high enough shutter speed. And the other thing is like if it's dark out, right, or there's not a lot of light, you're going to be wide open. So 3.5 would be considered wide open on this. Where if it's bright, you could be at like 8 or 11 or 16. It's really going to depend on the light you have available to you. So what you would do, and the way this camera works, that there's a meter on the left-hand side with a plus at the top and a minus at the bottom and a needle, and you want to get that needle in between the two. The needle in between the two, you have a correct exposure, okay? So think about this. If you're outside and it's sunny out, you're going to be at 250th, 500, 1000. If you're inside and all the lights are on, you might be at 125th. You're probably going to be at 60th, or you're probably going to be at 30th. If you're outside, you're probably going to be at like 5, 6, 8, 11 if it's bright. If it's nighttime, you could be at 3.5 and you could be at 30th of a second. It really just depends on how much light you have available to you. And you really have to think about how much light do I have available to me, and does this exposure make sense? So if you're making pictures at night and you're at 1,000th of a second at f6, f11, nothing is going to turn out. But if you're outside in the daylight and you're at 30th of a second at 3.5, everything's going to be really overexposed, and that's probably not going to turn out either. So you need to think about, does this exposure make sense for the given light that I have? And I think that will really help you. If you're inside, you're probably going to be at 125th or below. And if you're outside and it's daylight, you're probably going to be at 125th and above. That's just a good kind of rule of thumb to think about. If you're inside, you'll be at 3.5 or, faster. Some lenses are faster than this. Some lenses aren't. It's going to depend on the lens you have. And if you're outside and it's bright, you're going to be at 5.6 or above. As the shutter speeds go higher number, it's a shorter time. As it goes lower number, it's a longer time. As the apertures go lower number, it's a wider aperture, and as it go higher number, it's a smaller aperture. So it gets a little smaller at 5.6. It gets a little smaller at 8. It gets a little smaller at 11. It gets a little smaller at 16. You may have a lens that goes to 22. It gets even smaller. You may have a lens that goes to 32. That gets even smaller. So think about, if I don't have a lot of light, I should be at 2.8 or 4 or somewhere around there. If I have a lot of light, I should be probably at 11 or 8, right? So think about that. Again, it all goes back to how much light you have in a given situation, okay? But what you want to remember is, for the whole roll, it's going to be at 400. Then you have to worry about your aperture, and you have to worry about your shutter speed. Hopefully this will help. Once you sort of get used to the camera that you have, it should make more sense. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to help. Thanks.